I want to welcome everybody. My name is Ryan Kellett. I'm the class of 2009.5. I promise you we have a great conversation coming up with two panelists, and we'll have some questions at the end. First, introduce the series that we're doing here. So first, is the title of this is Live from DC: Truth, Disinformation, Censorship, and Governance of the Online World. So we're going to cover a lot of topics this evening, and I'm going to be joined by two guests who have some really great background, both in government and in the private sector. And we will have some questions, like I mentioned at the end, from students. So a little bit about this session: the Center for Careers and Internships and Middlebury and DC, in collaboration with the Middlebury Professional Network, will bring you this webinar featuring a discussion among professionals who have a variety of vantage points on governments and private enterprises' roles in governing internet content. So if you have questions about that, I do too. So I'm your moderator again. My name is Ryan Kellett. I work at Axios, which is a newsletter company. If you haven't heard of it, that is, you can go to axios.com. That is my one plug of the evening. With me tonight, I have two guests. The first guest, and I'll have the guests turn on their cameras as we go here, Eric Einhorn, who is a parent of a student in class 2021 and 2025. Welcome, Eric. He's the Chief of Staff for U.S. Senator Brian Schatz, and he's based in DC. I'm also here based in DC. And he's been working with Senator Schatz since 2017, it sounds like, as Senior Counsel for Technology and Communications Policy. And our second guest tonight is Eli Sugarman, class of 2002, and he is the Director of Content for the Oversight Board, which we will, I'm sure, get to know lots more about this evening. Eli leads the core content moderation functions of an experimental online safety and speech regulator. I believe that's the Oversight Board, established to guide Facebook and Instagram on the most challenging content decisions globally. That's a bit of a mouthful, but I know that we'll get some clarity from Eli as we go. So before I get to asking them lots of questions, I thought one way we could jump into this conversation this evening is to review a bit of a video that I think is super, super relevant, and I was just captivated by when it came out. I hope you will be too. If you remember this video, it'll be really interesting to hear your take on it. Rachel?
Will you commit to ending Finsta?
Senator, again, let me explain. We don't actually do Finsta. What Finsta refers to is young people setting up accounts where they may want to have more privacy. You refer to it as privacy from their parents. What in my interaction with teens, what I found is that they sometimes like to have an account where they can interact just with a smaller group of friends.
Well, Finsta is one of your. Finsta is one of your products or services. We're not talking here about Google or Apple. It's Facebook, correct?
Finsta is slang for a type of account.
Okay, will you end that type of account?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking. What I can say is that based on what we've seen in terms of teens using those kinds of accounts, we've actually given them additional privacy options to address those kinds of issues where they want more privacy so that they can have more privacy.
Well, I don't think that's an answer to my question.
All right. So when I first saw that video, I just laughed. I was like, what in the world is even happening in this video? This senator seems out of touch. What's the deal here? I could not believe it. And, went down the sort of meme road here. But Eric, from your point of view, what is actually happening in this video as someone who works in government?
Yeah. So I actually watched most of that hearing, and certainly the beginning of it. So the context is so Senator Blumenthal is the chair of the subcommittee for consumer issues that oversees some of the internet issues, privacy, and some other relevant things for that hearing. There was a hearing that day, and among other witnesses, Antigone Davis, who works at Facebook, was one of the witnesses. And the thing that you don't see in that clip is at the beginning of the hearing, in the opening, as I recall it, Senator Blumenthal talked about evidence that at a prior hearing that Facebook whistleblower, who you may have read about in the news, that she, as part of the evidence that she put forward, she revealed that Facebook was actually looking at, essentially looking at Finsta techniques, we'll call it, that the kids are doing as a product. So ways that they could, essentially sell more ad space or get more eyeballs by encouraging kids to use Finsta to do that. So he didn't really hit the mark the way that he asked the question, but I also think that this was classic cat and mouse hearing games where Ms. Davis pretended like she didn't really know what he was talking about, and he made him out to be sort of the old guy who doesn't know what Finsta is. Maybe or maybe not, but I think Senator Blumenthal clearly knew what he was doing in the big picture, and it was a very relevant and fair question. But it became a meme, and that's one in the long line of old senator doesn't know technology meme.
Yeah, definitely. And us in the media probably also selectively chose that quote as well to run with. Before we get to you, Eli, I know we'll bring you in the conversation shortly. I wanted to see, Eric, do you have a primer on what is some of the language we need to sort of bring together this conversation today? A lot of it seems sort of like in the ether here. You hear things like section 230, what is that? What are the policy pieces of this? Give us a quick primer on what are we even talking about? I know this is a funny clip to start, but what are the sort of basics of what we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to do the short version, and we could dig in on other pieces if you want later or deeper. But I think it's helpful to start with thinking about things sort of pre-internet and post-internet. So pre-internet, media, so to speak, you can think of like a bookstore and books, right? So you have case law that goes to liability or responsibility for content. So pre-internet, back in the old days, the bookstore wouldn't be responsible for all the content of all the books in the bookstore. So if someone defamed someone else in a book, had some lawsuit, they wouldn't fare very well suing the bookstore, but they could fare very well if there was something, defaming a person in a book against the publisher or the author. So if you could sort of think about things on that continuum, you have publisher at one end and then sort of conduit media on the other end. And then, fast forward to the early days of the internet, there was some initial services, Prodigy was one, CompuServe was one. And there were some early cases where the courts were trying to sort out, are these platforms more like the bookstore, or are they more like the book publisher? And one court found in one case that a platform, I always mix up whether it's Prodigy or CompuServe that did what or which, but one of them essentially was like a bulletin board. So you could put up whatever you want, you could post whatever you want in these chat rooms or on these bulletin boards, and they didn't really moderate what was happening there. The other one took some steps to actually moderate the rooms and the speech that was happening on its platform. And in an interesting turn, the court, one court decided that if you moderate, then you're actively participating in the speech and you're responsible, you could be liable for the speech. In the other case, if it's just sort of like a bulletin board, you're not liable. And in an odd sort of way, it created this disincentive to try to manage the speech on your platform because you become responsible for it. So at the advent of the internet, I think safe to say Congress was thinking about, was concerned about how would the internet develop. People had grand hopes for a commercial internet, and I think had an inkling of what things would be like, but didn't necessarily know how, nobody could have envisioned the internet that we have today, but there was a lot of discussion about its potential. And Congress purposefully wanted to provide a means to businesses to moderate speech on their platform. Disney.com is going to be a very different experience than Pornhub, for example. And you want Disney to be able to create the environment that's safe for its customers, and Pornhub, I suppose, to have an environment that is suitable to its customers. And so what Congress did was it passed this thing called Section 230, which you may have heard of, in 1996. And the law did a few things, but one of the big things that it did was it said that these platforms, these internet platforms, are not publishers. So they're not responsible for the speech. They're more like the bookstore. One last thought, though, is I think at the time, the idea was that would create an opportunity, if not an incentive. I think the thought was that Congress's thought at the time, if you can attribute a thought to Congress, the thought at the time was that we wanted platforms to moderate speech. We wanted to encourage that. And so the Section 230 protection, liability protection, was there to encourage that. Then fast forward to maybe 2016, probably earlier, but certainly 2016 and the election, and then the Trump administration. The question of what is Section 230, how is it impacting at least political speech? There are other impacts for other kinds of speech as well, but became a real hot issue. And I think the one thing Republicans and Democrats agreed on is they all hated Section 230, but I think for different reasons. President Trump wanted to get rid of it because he thought that would mean that platforms would become neutral, like the bulletin board, and he could say whatever he wants and they couldn't moderate him. And then I think the Democrats, on the other hand, wanted more moderation and more responsibility from the platforms. So that's a little context. I think that's maybe relevant, but happy to talk about any of that more.
I love that. That's an incredibly concise history of the internet that you just did in like a minute, and that caught us right up to the present, which is where I'd love Eli to pick up from. The present and the future may be the way to go on this. Help us understand what challenges are we thinking about right now in content moderation moving forward, and a lot of the sort of forward-looking work that you're thinking about every day.
Yeah, no, I think Eric did a great job, and I think that everybody knows the internet has evolved quite a bit since 1996, right? When CDA 230 was passed, and what we're seeing now is, I think, a conversation that oftentimes touches on social media, right? Facebook, Twitter, other platforms that you use to connect with people, build relationships, share ideas. But I think really what you're seeing, if you're paying closer attention, is it's those plus basically any other company or entity that's operating online has content moderation challenges. By that I mean Amazon has content moderation decisions. If you look at some of the best performing books on COVID, it's just COVID misinformation straight up. Video game developers, right? Whether it's Pokemon Go or you name it, you have some fascinating questions about what sort of conduct is permissible, what sorts of comments should be allowed. It all goes to that interesting analogy that Eric pointed to about who's authoring the content. Is it a book? Is it a bookstore? Is it somebody then trying to magnify the sales and accelerate the spread of it? And what does that mean for liability, responsibility? So in a nutshell, I would say content moderation is everything is content moderation. And I'm stealing that line from Evelyn Douek, who's a great researcher at Harvard. If you don't follow her work, she has an aggressive and great Twitter game and is also a brilliant scholar. But really everything is becoming content moderation. Every website, every company, even government entities have to think about how they police what's allowed on their their websites, their products, their apps. And so if you think about it, it's different challenges at different levels of the internet stack, right? Think about a company like Cloudflare, a CDN, and content delivery network. And if you think about there, you may have bigger concerns about Cloudflare saying, hey, I don't like what these people, even if they're neo-Nazis and they're disgusting, abhorrent individuals, are saying. And if I boot them off Cloudflare, that may mean that they have no way to get on the internet because nobody else will let them deliver content. Is that more concerning than perhaps, a cloud provider who, there are a couple of those, right? Larger in number than CDNs, but still and then you move up and you think about, should Facebook have the same rules or different rules? And just to say that as you think about the different layers that these issues hit, I think it's fair to say there are different levels of concern that you may want to have about what types of speech and conduct should be permissible or impermissible. And that then gets to sort of some of the challenges, right? Which is how much of the responsibility is it on each of these companies or platforms to set their own rules and to enforce them and to regulate them? How transparent do they need to be about those rules? CDA 230, really does help create that safe space. But what it really does also in the US then, given our free speech and First Amendment traditions, is mean that government really isn't largely regulating that space, and it's left to individual companies to make those decisions. And they have widely different views and they have different systems. Some of them use more people to police that content and enforce the rules. Some use more automated tooling and algorithms and the much talked about AI and ML and other acronyms like that. And the truth of the matter is that the internet's growing and moving so fast, you can't have people sitting on top of all these decisions reviewing what speech is okay or not. You're going to have to automate it. And it boils down to what types of mistakes are you comfortable with when you write that code, when you build those algorithms that balance different considerations. And so, I think that's a bit abstract, but really what I want to point to is where we're moving to is really just, tracking the evolution of the internet and really the merging of the online and offline worlds. At Facebook, it's the metaverse, which is more virtual reality. You have Pokemon Go and others, which are augmented reality, and everything in between. And all of those create really interesting issues that are really important around content moderation that aren't just about what words did I write in a Facebook post and did that incite violence. It's much more, what did my avatar do? Am I harassing somebody by standing too close to them, by depicting myself or them in different ways? It's all sorts of really fascinating issues that I think are really important to talk about. So let me stop there. Happy to dig deeper, but looking forward to the conversation.
That's a great place to start. I can think of a number of different roads into that, but why don't we stick with that content moderation piece specifically? And why don't we do a brief detour to sort of First Amendment rights, right? I think this is like one of the areas that a lot of conversations, like you end up somewhere talking about First Amendment rights at just very quickly. So I kind of want to get it out of the way up front. So when we talk about that, you sort of talk about the line, Eli, like where do you draw that line, and and on what sort of level, right? Use the Cloudflare example. So I guess my question is, when we talk about something as like important to the country as First Amendment rights, where does that conversation take us, right? Where does it naturally lead? And maybe I would love to hear Eric jump in here and give us a sense here from the political and policy point of views, right? Like, okay, so you've got an amendment right on one end, right? Like how do you respond to that content moderation challenge specifically?
The First Amendment comes into this conversation maybe different places, but in particular, when we start talking about government regulation of these private companies, then the First Amendment's implicated, right? But if Facebook decides to have moderation processes on its own, you don't have President Trump does not have a First Amendment right to speak on Facebook or Twitter unless the government is regulating them. And this is a little confusing because we do have some media that are regulated, that do have speech that's regulated effectively by the government. So, broadcast TV is an example here, which is different. And, you even see this in the context of television where, the government doesn't regulate what Netflix can do online or what cable companies can do, but it does regulate NBC broadcast company, because NBC is broadcasting over the public airwaves and there's a license there. So it's important to think about that line where the First Amendment is and isn't. In the context of content moderation, though, it definitely is implicated to the extent we're talking about federal regulation. So amending Section 230, definitely we need to think about, does the First Amendment allow it or not? That's a little different than where I started, which was liability. So, individuals suing each other for harm. If Eli writes an article and says things that aren't true about me, I could sue him for slander. But that's not because of the First Amendment. So it's important to sort of put things in the right buckets here and think about that. That's all not to say that I guess we shouldn't forget that, leaving aside those distinctions, there are important public policy questions, business questions, legal questions, and so forth. And, and also just questions fundamental to our democracy and our society. So, the figuring out the right balance between free speech and protecting our democracy or protecting individual consumers, those are important policy questions. They may or may not implicate the law. Thinking about public policy that helps encourage companies to continue to create innovative products that don't harm their customers is important policy. Thinking about what responsibilities to our society companies have or should have, those are important questions. And we should have that discussion, and it's appropriate for Congress to have that discussion from an oversight perspective and ask, for example, ask Facebook, ask Antigone Davis, like, is this a good policy to have? Should you be encouraging kids to Finsta? Is a different question than should the federal government restrict Facebook's ability to enable Finsta, right? There's a lot going on there, but if you think about it in terms of law and policy and politics and business, I think it helps start to pull those pieces apart.
So Eli, where does an oversight board come into that at all, right?
Yeah,
that just seems totally separate, right? Or no?
Well, it's interesting. No, Eric set it up perfectly, right? Because the idea here is, because the government is not regulating this speech, each company is left to define for itself what are the right policies. And let's be honest, those policies oftentimes need a lot of work, right? And so the idea behind the oversight board was a few years ago. So the lore is Mark Zuckerberg grew tired and concerned about all these hard, difficult decisions about where to police the boundary and being that speech regulator on a multi-billion person social media platform. And as somebody more interested in building product and shipping code, thought there should be a different group of people who make those decisions, and created the oversight board to be the quote unquote Supreme Court of Facebook, which I think is like an awful analogy, but is the closest thing I've got to explain to what we are, which is basically like, I'm employed by an LLC funded through a Delaware trust that is irrevocable, that has money. And basically, like, we have a set of agreements with Facebook where you're a user, and Ryan, let's say you post something, it gets taken down, and you're like, no, it should go up. And Facebook says, actually, no, it's coming down because you violated this rule that's on our website. And you say, no, it should go back up. And they say, no, it's staying down. Once you exhaust those appeals, you can appeal to us. And then we have the binding authority to order Facebook to reinstate your content and say, nope, we've decided it goes back up on the platform. And if we make that determination within 7 days, Facebook has to put your content back up on the platform. That's the agreement we have with them. And so they have funded us to be independent, but still work closely with them to basically create a body of rules, interpretation, norms, if you will, that apply international human rights law to their content policies to try to create a more fair, transparent, equitable system for moderating speech on their platforms. And that's essentially what we do. And so it's this weird experimental thing where we get roughly 4,000 appeals a day from Facebook and Instagram users around the world saying, put my stuff up, or, hey, I saw this nasty post Eric put up, I want it taken down because I don't like it. And then we have processes to then pick, adjudicate, and then order Facebook how to change their rules, and then what to do about these individual decisions. And so basically it's a great example of how left to its own devices, like a company can choose to do something innovative, but it is the kind of experiment I think we need, because I don't think just overt government regulation is going to solve all these problems, nor is just leaving companies to their own devices. And so this sort of like interesting self-regulatory model I think is worth playing around with. And so that's essentially what we are. We're like the most well-resourced experiment in that space.
I love that. That's very interesting. I kind of want to ask, like, should every, I don't know, maybe the experiment's not over. Should every company have an oversight board then? I guess I will ask Eli first, and then I will hear Eric's actual response to that.
Yeah, it's a totally fair question. I think it depends, right? Like, I think, our goal is to show that this example is viable, that it can be positive and impactful. Some companies may hopefully want to join us someday. Some may want to say, hey, you're failing in this respect, and we're going to create something different. We don't want to be associated with you. We want different people making decisions, what have you. But I'm hoping we do sort of encourage more experimentation in this area, because I do think you need to create incentives to force companies to change the way they do things. I don't think the way content moderation at scale is happening right now in many places is up to par, right? Like taking down beheading videos of, and child sexual abuse imagery, and sort of that there are a couple categories of stuff that basically every company takes down because they think they have a legal obligation to do so, and the government or governments will come after them if they don't. But that then still leaves like a whole cesspool of really nasty, really harmful stuff. And how do you get to more consistent global norms and rules that aren't sort of totally different? Because like a lot of countries don't have a First Amendment, right? So you need to think about what is like a broader, consistent way to treat people equitably around the world. And we have one approach, right? It's anchored in human rights law. It's messy, it's hard, it may not be perfect. But I do think you want to encourage more experiments. And I think it would be good for other companies to sort of think about what kinds of similar experiments would they be interested in participating in.
Well, Eric, should all these companies be joining the oversight board or starting their own oversight boards? What would the government have to say to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think the government's going to require that anytime soon, but it's, look, Facebook's really unique. It just its size alone, there's nothing else like it. So it's interesting to watch. I wish Eli and his colleagues all the best, and hope they can figure this out. And I think that it's a very useful, important experiment, and I hope it goes well. And maybe other companies can learn from that along the way, but I don't see that as the solution for most companies. And as Eli noted in the beginning, the content moderation issue and internet regulation more generally is a very hard problem generally, but it's hard because it's made harder because you're dealing with so many different kinds of companies, right? I mean, we're not just talking about social media, we're talking about, comments in response to an article in the New York Times, where Eli brought up Amazon, Etsy, whatever. There are just so many. The beauty of the internet is the diversity of the business plans and also the size of the company. So coming up with a one-size-fits-all solution, leave aside the First Amendment, is super challenging. One place where we've really focused, where Senator Schatz is focused, and I think makes a lot of sense, is starting with transparency. So Facebook has moderation rules. It publishes those. Is it publishing all of its moderation rules? We've found out that maybe it's not. It apparently it's like Starbucks, it had a secret recipe set or secret menu. And if you were a VIP, you had a different set of moderation rules, apparently. So a starting point could be companies get to decide, platforms get to decide what their rules are going to be, but they have to publish them. They have to be clear and concise, and they have to follow them, and they have to report on how they're following them. That seems like a pretty easy place to start. We're not telling companies, we wouldn't be telling companies what kind of moderation practices to have, just that if they have them, we encourage them to have them. If they have them, they have to be clear about what they are and follow them. So I think that's something that wouldn't have a First Amendment problem. It would not solve all the issues we see, but it would go a long way towards creating an environment where consumers could be better informed, can make choices about whether they want to subscribe to a service or join a platform's product, or buy something from a platform. So I think there are things that we can do that advance the ball, and I think we need to be careful about what, as the government, what kind of rules we set up from that perspective, but also just recognizing the different sizes and capabilities of companies, leave aside the different business plans. A small restaurant at the corner that has a website isn't going to have the ability to create an overboard and hire an Eli and other people to manage that. That's just not necessary, and it's also not conceivable.
Yeah, definitely. So I am someone who's published a set of content moderation guidelines in my time. I used to work at the Washington Post, and we had to moderate comments on the bottom of the website. So that New York Times example, Eric mentioned.
I should have said the Washington Post.
You should have mentioned the Washington Post version of that. Yes. And one of the transparency things we did was we said, hey, here's exactly what we will take down and how. And it still was a mess, right? It still was really hard every day. And the amount of readers I heard from and corresponded with early in my career was a really big part of that. So before we transition into the careers part, which we are gearing up to do in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, so the questioners should be ready to get started soon. I do want to, I feel like some people probably have heard a little bit about what other countries are doing, what other regulations might be out there. I would love to hear from both of you as you think about, when we talk about regulations and policies and other experiments that are out there. How should the US be thinking about that specifically, and as influenced by what is happening elsewhere? Are we leading the way? Are we behind? I guess I'm kind of confused as to our status in the and progress on sort of moderation, content moderation, and where we are on governance. Eli, do you want to take a crack at that first?
Yeah, sure. No, and I would just commend everybody to read Casey Newton's great newsletter Platformer, which I think had a really insightful yet snarky, as usual, commentary on the state of the international internet regulation. And I think it's fair to say that Europe is charging ahead in many ways, right? The right to be forgotten with privacy, has been, an early, has presaged sort of the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is, trying to become the global paradigm on how you regulate many of these things, including content moderation, right? And contemplates, as I understand it, certain requirements around content moderation, certain standards, content moderation as a service providers, even potentially transparency reporting. And so I do think that Europe, to use that large landmass as sort of an example, is sort of one that people really need to pay attention to, that I think is quite relevant. I think, next, you should always look at some of the largest markets for these companies that are, whether that's China, depending on which platform or company we're talking about, which tends to have some policies which I would argue are extremely problematic, and some which may be slightly less and more innovative, to countries like India, where, much like Eric's commentary on Section 230, the government in power there has passed some new regulations on intermediary liability, really that are not consistent with the US approach or perhaps some other democracies' approach to regulating content and those who post the content. And so I think it's a complex tapestry. I would argue US leadership is somewhat absent globally, and that it's been on the wane for a little bit. And I think it's nice to see like-minded democracies in certain countries trying to repair and find some sort of common ground, which over the preceding years has not really been as firm as it used to be. And just to sort of add an asterisk to my previous comment to riff off Eric, I think regulation clearly has a role to play here. And I think, like Eric said, it's about being right-sized. I think transparency is a great example. I think there's some other ways that you can think about, what are the right level of requirements for different kinds of companies? Are there service providers who can service them that can be held to higher standards? Because I do think that it all starts with, you need to put people on notice what's allowed and what's not. And that whole concept is enshrined in our legal system and others. And many companies do not do that as well as they should. Yeah, that's what I would offer to start that conversation.
Eric, where is the U.S. in the grand matrix of progress on these issues?
I mean, for the time being, I think we're well behind. If you think that the goal or the end is to regulate, my perspective is that some level of guardrails here. I'll use a euphemism for regulation, but I think it's a good one in the sense that having really prescriptive specific rules is hard. It's hard to do, and usually that's reactive to things that have already happened. And we don't know what the problems are that lie ahead. And a lot of the things that we've seen are things that probably aren't going to hopefully won't repeat themselves necessarily in the same exact way. What we really need is companies that are engaged, accountable, and responsible. And so our view in this office, and the senators talked about this a lot, is that what he would like to do is to create the right incentives for things to happen at the board of directors level. If you create very specific set of rules, you have lawyers and engineers modifying products or creating policies to get around those things or to just manage for those things. But what we really want, I think, is a board of directors and a CEO, the leadership of the company, running a company in a way that's responsible, that looks out for its customers, that doesn't abuse consumers. And I would argue that having a reasonable set of guardrails is good for business. We've seen a number of examples in history where the government was kind of late to the party and didn't create those guardrails, and you ended up with a race to the bottom. So you have the good companies that are trying to do the right thing that end up having to, for economic reasons, chase after the companies that don't care. And aren't looking out for their customers or abusing their customers. And consumers can't always tell. The internet can be a daunting, complex place, and consumers, privacy is a great example, right? I mean, the way we handle privacy right now is, you go on to a website and they give you a little click box and they tell you to read this 20 screen thing that, I'm a lawyer, I never read them, and multiply that times every website you're going on. You have no idea what the company's doing with your private information, and they could change it at any time, and just all they need to do is put it in that list. So you end up with a situation where you kind of over lawyer these things, and what we really need is responsible people at the top creating products that are reasonable and good for consumers. So I think that's where we would end up heading. And I think that not just because I believe that's the right answer, but because to me, that's sort of the sweet spot between, where Republicans want to go and Democrats want to go, right? That's a reasonable place to be. And it leaves a lot of room for companies to fight it out on the field of competition, which is exactly what we want, and which fits really well with our free market economy sort of approach, right? So that's where I think we will head. But where we're starting from, I think, is really we're still burdened by the beginning of the internet and a fear of killing the internet in its cradle. So there's a lot of concern that lingers about doing anything and hindering business. I'm not that worried about slowing down Facebook, but the next Facebook is something to think about and worry about. But we don't want the next Facebook to be an even worse version of Facebook that drags everything down into the mud, right? So I think Europe has a different approach. and maybe we can learn something from them. So we watch closely and see, but I don't see us sort of just taking wholesale what they're doing and bringing it on board.
Yeah, definitely. I want to, let's go ahead and pause it right there, put a pin in that. That sounds like a good place to go. We're going to go to some Q&A with students now. We have 3 students lined up here. We're going to start with Layli Manafi, class of 2022, computer science major with a minor in religion. It says here, Layli, do you have a question that you're looking to get answered this evening?
Hi, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Eric and Eli. That was a great. I thoroughly enjoyed, very thoughtful. I have so many questions, but so I was curious what you think, if should there be a limitation on how fast stuff are growing in the world of tech and startups?
I could start. So I think what makes this country great is just what you described, that any person could start a business that can grow into the next gigantic company. But most of those companies don't make it. It's a great way to get good products, but it's a tough way to make a living, right? So I don't personally have a concern about that. And I think that, again, sort of harkening back to the comments I just made right before this, I think that the key is to create some reasonable parameters around what companies can do, in order, and with a focus of protecting consumers. I think we need to have a perspective from the consumer out, because they're the ones who use the products, but they're also the ones who could be harmed by it. And if we take that approach and create that sort of safe space for consumers, but also enough room for companies to innovate, I think we'll continue to be fine.
Yeah, and just to build off that, like I tend to agree with Eric, where I think the key is you need to create incentives so that a venture capital firm that's investing understands like the upside, but then also the risk and its responsibilities. If it invests in a company that misuses user data, or after it goes defunct, it doesn't safeguard that, and that leads to it being compromised, identity theft, whatever. We don't have a good system right now that actually incentivizes investors to actually factor in that risk and to price it in accurately. And I'm not advocating for necessarily a European style privacy regulation, which can arguably so onerous that it locks in only big incumbents because they're the only ones who can comply, given how onerous and tough it is, and doesn't actually scale well to smaller companies. But I do think there's room for improvement, but it wouldn't be capping the number of companies. It would be creating those incentives to get the investors and others to actually price the risk, have to think about companies developing their products differently, not making security an afterthought, but by design early on, privacy by design, security by design. And you need a culture change, but then also you need some incentives to change to really make that happen in the private sector.
Thank you.
Amazing. We're going to move on to our next question from Alex Demely, also class of 2022 in a major in mathematics and political science. Alex, take us away.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This has been lovely. So you've talked a lot about how the nature of speech has changed, and the requisite regulatory questions that accompany those shifts. What I'd be interested to know is how you think the changing media landscape has affected how public officials actually communicate with their constituents, and to kind of tied into as college students, what experiences young people should get interested in if they want to enter public office in order to learn those communication skills.
Eric, that seems more up your alley, but
okay. I didn't want to elbow my way to the front of the line again.
No,
but,
go for it.
I'm happy to. Well, I agree. I mean, I think that the nature of political speech, or at least the means to speak, have changed because of the internet and new technologies. And that's like anything, that's good and bad, I think. It's good in that members politicians are able to speak more directly to individuals, kind of in a way that's more relevant to them. For better or worse, I'd say worse, but President Trump was really good at this on Twitter. I think my boss is really great at this. And that can be a good thing from a democratic perspective if used well, or from a democracy perspective, not democratic, from a democracy perspective, if done well. We've also seen though the downside of that, right? With disinformation, we don't have responsible organizations mediating speech anymore in the way that we used to. We had, before you were born, when we had the nightly news and people like Walter Cronkite who would sort of sort through and figure out what was important for us to hear. We don't have that anymore. And I do think our society is missing that to a certain extent. But I certainly wouldn't say that it's all good or all bad. In the end, it all comes back to the sort of responsibility and accountability that both Eli and I think have been talking about. And if we can keep our democracy, then presumably voters will reward or punish politicians who do a good job at that or don't.
Yeah, and I think right. I mean, I think the challenge is, right, sometimes the ease with communication and amplification, you can get out a plea for help, you can inspire people, you can do positive things, and the invocation of the former president, I think, is apt, because that's, the most well-known case the Oversight Board dealt with was, what should Facebook do about the former president's account, which was suspended indefinitely following 2 posts on January 6th that, more or less praised the insurrection that was happening and basically, I think rightly was viewed as supporting what was transpiring at the Capitol, which was quite dangerous, which I'm sure Eric and his colleagues felt much more than us watching with concern on TV. But I think to Eric's point, right, we no longer have those institutions that intermediate, right? There have always been potentially dangerous views, right? Whether it's extremist views from the John Birch Society that would never get more than a couple hundred people reading their newsletter because no newspaper would publish their crazy views, and Walter Cronkite wouldn't give them airtime. Now it's governments that are authoritarian can easily get millions of followers and inspire folks across their borders. And I think you're seeing that play out, whether it's in Russia, Brazil, even in the United States. And I think it's a really hard problem to solve. I think, Alex, to your question of like what can you and your generation do? I think one of the best experiences I ever had was I interned for Senator Chris Dodd back when he was the senior senator from Connecticut, and engaged with constituents, learned to talk to them. What I dealt with was more letters that were written and phone calls that came in, as opposed to but it evolves, to your point, and you would always see the letters that came in about the black helicopter circling my house. You'd be like, okay, that's the person who believes in black helicopters, but you'd get a lot of substantive stuff. And I think that your generation is going to have to fix some of these problems, to be honest with you, and find those new ways to communicate, to amplify the positive, to inspire, to reinvest in the health of American democracy, as opposed to letting the forces that I think are tearing it apart prevail. And that's in one way a lot of pressure, but just to encourage everybody who's thinking about volunteering for a campaign, interning, whatever the case may be, I think there's nothing better you can do with your time than actually giving public service a chance and really trying to find your way to contribute and to communicate with others to really contribute to the health of the country.
I mean, I'll also take a crack at that and just say that, I think my experience coming at it from a media point of view has been really interesting too, to try to kind of get a different lens on this, right? The Washington Post, when I got there, still thought it was the Washington Post, and it could be that sort of intermediary. And I think it became very clear as a very internet-centric person that like it was not, right? Like it doesn't matter how 100 million, even if you reach 100 million US adults over the age of 18 in the United States, like you still there's so many other options, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of work to be done in newsrooms as well to really understand and build trust and have some of the hard conversations. Those are workplaces as a career conversation, as part at least, right? That those are organizations that have a huge variety of, generations of people in them. And there's the ability to sort of say, hey, like some of the ideas matter, some of the speaking to readers, and readers who engage in the news are often the same type of people who are writing into their senator or are really engaged in that conversation. So I'd throw in a plug in there for a media career in there as well, in all its iterations, despite the decline of some parts of the media, particularly local news. And if you feel so inspired, I do think local news in particular needs all the help that it can get, and I think is one of the places where you can truly feel sort of democracy in its media form. And I think that you can sometimes lose that a little bit in the national media scene. Local news is where you actually can kind of, I think, have the greatest connection to the place and the people, and the issues that matter. Alex, any follow-up or comments before I move on?
No, that was great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks, Alex. Okay, we're moving on to Caitlin Pease, class of 2022, a major in computer science and psychology. I feel like this is Jeopardy. Caitlin, what is your question? Take us away.
First of all, thank you both so much. This has been great. Going to my question, so the global big data market reached billions of dollars in 2020 and is only expected to grow. I myself am considering going into data analytics or data visualization. And so I'm just wondering, should the growth of this industry spark just concern about both privacy and the spread of misinformation? And if yes, how can we address this concern?
I'm happy.
Yeah, why don't you go first, Eli?
Sure. I mean, I'd say yes. I'd say, like, as somebody whose data is copied, controlled, owned by all sorts of websites, reselling it, using it for means that I did not sort of like knowingly agree to. Yeah, I'm concerned. I'm also concerned by some of the conclusions that companies and governments reached based upon data sets that they analyze. And so, whether that's the repression of Uyghurs in China, or whether that's credit determinations in other countries, the harm that we've already witnessed, plus the potential for future harm and discrimination is really acute. And that gets, more severe, arguably, as you sort of aggregate more and more data and you don't have a clear guardrails and clear controls. I don't exactly know what the solution there is, but if that is an area you're thinking about going into, I think that's great, because I think sort of that merger of sort of ethics and data analysis and visualization is hugely important. I think lots of companies are hiring for it. I know I'm trying to hire for it at the Oversight Board, because like we need to build out our data capacity to actually hold Facebook to account. And the only way we actually know if we're having an impact and we're a worthwhile experiment is if I can track, once we issue a decision, how that changes what Facebook does, and then the behavior of users tied to that. So does it benefit them? Does a certain kind of hate speech drop, or is it enforced against more accurately, or whatever that measure is? And so just to say, like, I would wholeheartedly encourage you to think about a ethically minded career in that space. And I'm sure Eric has the solution to what do we do about the morass. So I gave him the easy part.
Yeah, I don't know. I was gonna go for the other direction. I'm not sure I have the solution to the morass, but we'll keep working at it. But in terms of your career question, I'd say the great news is you're at an amazing liberal arts institution, and I'd encourage you to study ethics and political science and the humanities, and get that, take advantage of that liberal arts view. And in addition to, getting the math and science piece under your feet firmly, it's important to be technically proficient. But the thing that will distinguish you in the future and will give us some hope as a country, I think, is to have you and people like you who have that broad perspective. So, it's important to take those computer science classes and be good at those skills. but it's just as important to be able to think and write well. Those are the things that are really going to launch you in your career. And there's lots of opportunity in government, outside of government, to work in policy, to work on policy issues or the technical issues. But wherever you land, you'll be able to think about all those different aspects and to hopefully help us fix things, because we're really going to need to rely on your generation to continue to, hopefully our generation can help fix some things, but there are a lot of problems that will still need fixing. And I can't tell you how impressed I am with your generation, and we're going to really need you.
Caitlin, any parting thoughts to those responses?
No, that was great. I have a lot to think about right now, but thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. So we're just about to wrap up here. I want to ask one last question of both Eric and Eli. At Axios, we always have this thing that's called Why It Matters. That's sort of the thing we think is missing from a lot of news. You see it in a lot of our articles. We say why it matters in bold. Why does it matter that we both take an interest in this, and in particularly for the careers conversation, why someone should go into, to Caitlin's question, a career in a field that deals with truth, disinformation, and censorship and governance in this world? Give me that pitch of why it matters. I'm going to start with Eli.
I mean, I think we're having this event because these are issues of societal import, right? Countries are being torn apart quite literally because of online speech rumors and leading to real world harm. And the solutions are going to come from the next generation who understand the technology, the humanities. Like Eric said, you need to be multidisciplinary and able to straddle and really connect the pieces into holistic solutions. No single discipline will solve any of these problems. And so it matters because you're the first adopters, the new technology users, and the internet is growing faster than Eric or I or Ryan or even can fathom, and it's going to be incumbent upon you to bring that mixed skill set you're learning at Middlebury to bear to solve those problems, to make people's lives better. It's about making people's lives better.
That was very concise. Eric, take us away.
Yeah, it's hard to top that. I guess I went for, in my mind, because the future of our democracy depends on it. And I think that comes back to literally not just the quality of our lives, but with climate change and insurrections and all the things that we're facing, can also just come back to literally our lives. So the stakes are high, and we need to get this right. And like I said, I have so much confidence in all of the students on this webinar, I guess it is, it's never been more important to have a smart, engaged, dynamic next generation following on.
Amazing. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and take us out here. I want to thank both Eric and Eli for joining us this evening and for the questions. Thank you so much. I'm Ryan Kellett. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.